Dear friends, I'm Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the 27th edition of the Russian Newspapers Monitor. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for your feedback and your comments. Please continue supporting Newsbud and become a member of our community. Now, let's look at the front page news stories in major Russian newspapers. We begin today with the front page of Rossiyskaya Gazeta, the Russian government-owned newspaper, the edition for March 31st, 2017. On the left side of the front page, there is a title of an article which appears in full on page 4. The title reads, "In Germany, the Russian speakers are being recruited to take part in a NATO military exercise." The subtitle on page 4 says that a German human resources agency is seeking actors with, quote, "a good knowledge of Russian language to take part in the NATO exercise." The article reports that the ad by the agency called Optronic appeared on the official site of the German capital, Berlin.de. The NATO military exercise in question is supposed to take place on the German military grounds Hohenfels between Nuremberg and Regensburg in Bavaria. When the Rossiyskaya Gazeta reporter called the numbers indicated in the ad, nobody answered the phone. This is surprising and definitely defeats the purpose of the ad. How can the persons who are interested in applying contact the agency? Still, what I think happened is that the ad attracted so much publicity that the agency is now trying to pretend as if nothing happened and to stay out of the public limelight until the whole story is forgotten. According to the article, the Optronic official website states that in 2014, the agency won a contract from the U.S. Armed Forces to assist them in, quote, "modeling the reactions of civilian population on the battlefield," end quote. The ad also sought individuals speaking Polish and Czech languages, as well as the languages spoken in Afghanistan, Pashto and Dari. According to the scenario, the place of action was supposed to be a region in Afghanistan, and more than 10 villages with up to 30 homes each have been constructed on the Hohenfels grounds. The purpose of the exercise was described as estimating the risks of civilian casualties in a military crisis situation. The article notes that the actors would be paid up to 120 euros per day, and that the exercise would take place from April 28th until May 15th. In my opinion, it is very interesting that the Russian speakers are being sought, even though the scenario of the exercise depicts Afghanistan, and not, for instance, the Caucasus region or the Russian-friendly Central Asian states. Does this mean that NATO is anticipating getting into a proxy war with Russians in Afghanistan? Are we witnessing a repetition of the Cold War struggle between the US and the Soviet Union there? Indeed, not long ago, the Supreme Military Commander of NATO, the U.S. General Curtis Scaparotti, stated that Russia was aiding the Taliban. This is hard to believe, but the fact that the Russian special forces may be back in Afghanistan not to aid the Taliban, but to reassert the Russian influence there sounds plausible to me. Russia has seen Afghanistan as falling under its influence since the 19th century. And in fact, Afghanistan was one of the most hotly contested regions in the geopolitical great game between the Russian and British empires. The Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan in the 1970s precisely because it saw Afghanistan as very important for its national security interests.
Let's go recruit these mujahideen, and let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union.
Now we may be seeing Russia following in the steps of the former Soviet Union, but using covert rather than overt military means. And so, in addition to Syria and Libya, Afghanistan may be yet another country in which NATO failed to fulfill any of its long-term goals, and which it is now losing to its geopolitical competitors, not only Russia, but also China. The Eurasian powers seem to be gaining the upper hand over the Atlantics all over Central Asia and the Middle East. The most dramatic geopolitical realignment since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 is taking place in front of our eyes. The news for NATO is not good, though its leadership appears to be no less willing to indulge in expensive and lethal false narratives than during the time period when it seemed that the entire world was going its way. But try as they might, they cannot bring back the past. The only problem is that in trying to do so, they may cause a nuclear inferno and destroy the entire planet. Now, let's take a look at Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for April the 3rd, 2017. On the bottom of the front page on the far left, there is an article entitled, "Germany does not want to pay taxes for NATO." The subtitle explains that the official Berlin is resisting the pressures from the official Washington. The article reports that the German officials have publicly rejected the calls of the presidential administration of Donald Trump to increase their defense spending to 2% of the GDP. The German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel called the increase absolutely unrealistic. According to the article, the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who was in Brussels for the meeting of NATO foreign ministers, insisted that all NATO member states must increase their defense budgets as soon as possible. The article states that even though all NATO foreign ministers formally agreed with Tillerson's demand, the opposition to further military expenditures is brewing in many European capitals, especially in Berlin. The German officials also seem unhappy with Trump's recent statement that Germany owes the United States money for defending it over the years. According to the article, Tillerson nonetheless went on the offensive and demanded a detailed plan on how the European NATO member states will reach the required 2% GDP defense spending by 2024. He wanted the plan to be ready by the end of April this year, so that it could be formally accepted at the May summit. The article reports that the German Foreign Minister Gabriel reacted to Tillerson's statement by saying sarcastically, "Yes, we do have a plan. It's called budget." Gabriel, who is the main figure of the German Social Democratic Party, stated at a recent party congress that no foreign government could pressure Germany to spend more on defense than Germany itself determines it is necessary. And according to Gabriel, 2% of the GDP is much too much. On the other hand, according to the article, Gabriel's opponents from the Christian Democratic Party, such as the Chancellor Angela Merkel and the Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen, stated that the increase would indeed take place by 2024. However, neither Merkel nor von der Leyen publicly disputed Gabriel's claims. In my opinion, it is clear they don't want this to turn into an election issue, because they know that the German voters are very much opposed to any further spending on defense, and that they would punish the Christian Democrats at the polls accordingly. However, I still believe that it will happen, and Merkel will be pushed out of the position of the Chancellor. The article also cites the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who at this time is on the board of the Russian natural gas and oil giant Gazprom, that according to the recent testimony in Congress, the FBI director James Comey has never heard of. Schröder is seen as a friend of Vladimir Putin, and therefore, not surprisingly, he claims that NATO has greatly exaggerated the so-called Russian threat, and that the increase in military spending in Germany is unnecessary. Interestingly, Schröder is also quoted as saying that Putin acts more rationally in making political decisions than Trump, but that it would be great for world peace if they would get along. In my opinion, what we are seeing here is a clear sign that Trump and his administration regard NATO as a burden for the kind of the US foreign and security policy they envision. They will no doubt force the Europeans to make a clear choice. Either you pay up or NATO is out. This means that NATO faces a turbulent future and that its days may indeed be numbered. Of course, there will be quite a lot of pushback against NATO demise from many in the Washington foreign policy and intelligence establishments who have fattened their paychecks for years, propounding the hegemonic Atlanticist ideology whose end goal was the formation of a federal state made up of the United States, Canada, and the European Union, with Washington being subordinated to Brussels. The agenda seems to have been derailed, but who knows, it may rise like a zombie after a potential catastrophic false flag event blamed on the Russians or their allies in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, or Central Asia. This is why we may see further and more malicious NATO provocations against Russia in order to get Putin to overreact and then position NATO as an indispensable protector of the European peace and security. For instance, what is the security status of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine? The biggest one in Zaporozhye is not far from the lines of confrontation. I have written on this issue for Boiling Frogs Post more than 2 years ago, and now it has become relevant again, in my opinion. However, with the potential victory of Marine Le Pen in the presidential election in France, NATO is likely to suffer such a heavy blow that, coupled with the Turkish President Erdogan's recent anti-NATO moves, together they may finally bring down the organization. The most vocal Western warmongers in Europe would lose their main financial sponsor, and the Eurasian-wide reconciliation might be given a chance. Now, let's go to the front page of Izvestia, the moderate pro-government newspaper, the edition for April 4th, 2017. This edition came a day after the bomb attack on St. Petersburg metro, and just like the front pages of all other major Russian newspapers on April the 4th, had the article about the attack on the front page. In fact, this article takes up the entire front page, and the following pages 2 and 3 of the newspaper are also devoted to the description of the attack and the reactions of various Russian officials and analysts. The article's title stresses the courageous endurance in the face of adversity. It states, St. Petersburg prevailed, while the subtitle emphasizes that the terrorists were not successful in causing a panic in the city. The photograph below the title shows a person lighting a candle at a makeshift memorial for the victims near the metro station. The article presents the chronology of the attack known at the time of the writing. The bomb exploded in a train car while the train was moving between the Senaya Ploshad station and the Technologichesky Institute station. 11 people were killed. Later, the number increased to 14, and more than 45 were wounded, some of them critically. The article does not get into discussing possible suspects and motives, but instead the reporter, who was not far from the scene of the attack, offers a first-hand account on how ordinary people reacted to the crisis situation in the center of the city. Considering that both the street traffic and the metro were blocked, thousands of people found themselves scrambling for ways and means to get away from the city center. The report also describes how different city services, from the police to the fire brigades and medical emergency crews, dealt with the attack's aftermath, and states that they did not seem well prepared to deal with the emergency of this magnitude. In contrast to Moscow, St. Petersburg so far has not been a subject to this kind of attack. The article reports that the Russian President Vladimir Putin was in St. Petersburg at the time of the attack and was meeting with the Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko on the occasion of the founding day of the Union of Russia and Belarus, which may also be significant if the attack is seen as perhaps signaling the opposition to this union. In my opinion, the fact that Putin was in St. Petersburg and that it is well known that St. Petersburg is his hometown and presumably more dear to him than any other place in Russia strongly suggests that this attack was intended as a political message to him personally. What kind of message could it be? Perhaps the message to stay away from Libya, to get out of Syria, or the Middle East in general. Or it may have something to do with the Russian involvement in Ukraine. Or another possibility is that it is related to the rising Chechen militancy in the Caucasus region. Just a few weeks ago, 6 members of the Russian National Guard were killed by radical Chechen militants in a surprising attack on their camp. In any case, the message was something along the lines, see how strong we are. We can viciously attack your fellow citizens in broad daylight, and you cannot stop us. It is interesting that according to one of the articles on page 3 of the newspaper, the St. Petersburg police and the FSB had some kind of advanced knowledge of the danger, because they began searching for a possible bomb already during the morning, several hours before the explosion. However, according to this article, the searches were made at different stations from the ones affected by the bomb. It should be added that an unexploded device was found by the police on the Ploshad Vastania station, near the station where the bomb actually exploded, and then the decision was made to shut down the entire metro system. No doubt, many versions of the attack will come to light as time goes by, and many theories will be constructed. However, by the time this article was published, no radical or terrorist group claimed responsibility for the attack. It is known that if ISIS had been involved, it would have claimed responsibility fairly quickly, and so it appears that it was not ISIS. It will be interesting to see who the official Russian investigation will point to as suspects. Perhaps the individuals involved in this attack were members of the so-called sleeper cells of the radical jihadists that the newspaper Izvestia wrote about in an earlier edition. In any case, if we also consider that just last week there were anti-government protests throughout Russia, it appears that certain powerful and brutal political forces are very much intent on destabilizing Russia and the Putin regime. Last week I called the protests, which by the way are scheduled to continue in full force at the end of April, I called them Destabilization of Russia Act 1. Well, just a week has passed and we already seem to be at Act 2. What will be the Act 3? A high-level assassination, the use of a chemical or a biological weapon? Somebody may be in a hurry to get the job done. Now, we'll go once again to Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, but this time to the edition for April 5th, 2017. On the entire upper part of the front page, there is an article with the title in big black letters stating that Russian special forces are practicing for landings in Belarus. The subtitle explains that the official Moscow and Minsk are preparing for possible armed attacks by subversive forces and illegal military formations. Below the title and the subtitle, there is a photograph of the Russian and Belarusian troops in a joint military exercise near the Belarusian city of Vitebsk. The article reports that Russia and Belarus will soon sign a whole series of documents strengthening their joint military defense and security. According to the article, these documents will not only increase the frequency of joint military exercises on the territory of Belarus, which borders several NATO states, but will also, for the first time, allow the Russian special forces to conduct covert missions against potential NATO-supported illegal armed groups in Belarus. The article states that this was one of the decisions agreed upon during the recent summit in St. Petersburg between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. Lukashenko himself confirmed that he and Putin discussed the ways to strengthen the security of the two countries. However, according to the article, it is still not clear whether Lukashenko agreed to the opening of a Russian military base in Belarus, which, in my opinion, would definitely be one of the methods to bring the two countries closer together. The article notes that last month, Lukashenko claimed that the security forces of Belarus arrested dozens of militants allegedly trained in the camps in Ukraine, Lithuania, and Poland, and illegally smuggled into the country to overthrow his regime. This appears to be the main reason as to why he agreed to allow Russian special forces to enter Belarus and presumably stay there for longer periods of time. The governments of Ukraine, Lithuania, and Poland rejected Lukashenko's allegations, but that, of course, was only to be expected. No country will admit that it trains militants to take down the government of its neighbors, however geopolitically antagonistic they may be. In addition, we know that anything military that goes on in the Baltics and Poland is under control and supervision of the NATO headquarters in Brussels and the virulent anti-Russian ideologues among its top military leadership. The article also notes that Russia and Belarus are preparing one of the biggest military exercises in recent history, called Zapad 2017 or West 2017, which will take place in Belarus in September. The NATO satellite intelligence services, such as the main Lithuanian intelligence agency, have already begun supplying the Baltic mass media with war-mongering propaganda, alleging that the Russians are planning to provoke clashes on the Polish and Lithuanian borders during the exercise. The Russian government rejected the allegations, but this is not to say that the NATO side may not try to engineer some kind of a false flag event and then blame it on the Russians. It is indicative of the strategic thinking of the Russian General Staff that at this time there is a joint military exercise of the Russian and Belarusian special forces near Vitebsk directed against a supposed hostile military infiltration. The similar exercise will take place later this year near the Polish border. And also in June of this year, Belarus will host an international military exercise called the Slavic Brotherhood 2017, which will bring together the soldiers of Belarus, Russia, and Serbia. There is no doubt that NATO will respond to these intensified Russian-Belarusian military efforts by sending even more troops and weapons to Eastern Europe, as well as by stepping up the media propaganda and intelligence special operations. In my opinion, when all of this is considered from a historical perspective, it becomes clear that we may be witnessing the emergence of a new type of Gladio operation, which I would call Gladio C, after the Gladio A, which was financed by the CIA and other Western intelligence services and directed against the communist and leftist political forces in Europe, and the Gladio B, described in detail by Newsbud's founder and editor, Sibel Edmonds, which depended on the use of the so-called jihadi radical Islamists to bring down and destroy secular and autonomous governments in the Middle East and Central Asia. Now we have Gladio C, the training of pro-fascist and nationalist Atlanticist forces directed against Russia and its allies in East Europe and beyond. This, therefore, is the new name of the old game, Gladio C. The main goal of Gladio C is to make impossible the coming together of a continental bloc from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Its priorities at this time are to destabilize all Russian allies, to sour the relations between Russia and Turkey, and Russia and China, and ultimately to create political unrest and social chaos in Russia itself. Lastly today, let's take a look at the front page of Pravda, the newspaper of the largest opposition party in Russia, the Communist Party of Russia, the edition for April the 4th, 2017. On the top of the front page, there is an article which presents the statement by the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Russia regarding the recent anti-corruption protests in Moscow and other cities. The title of the article is "The Government and not the Orange pro-Western revolutionaries are the cause of the street protests." In the article, the Russian communists criticized both Alexei Navalny, who was the leader of the protests, and the Russian government. According to the communists, Navalny is a fake opposition leader who works in tandem with the faction within the Russian government and is being used by this faction to fight another faction. As I pointed out in an earlier podcast, in my opinion, the Russian President Putin intends to replace the Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev with his longtime friend and KGB colleague Nikolai Patrushev and is likely using Navalny, whose main anti-corruption message is directed precisely against Medvedev, for this purpose. And thus, whether he knows it or not, Navalny might be a tool in the fight of the Siloviks against the liberals within the Kremlin. At the same time, and especially if he is a willing partner in this game and a covert FSB informant, Navalny could also be used by Putin to fool the West and make it financially and logistically support a political option that has no chance whatsoever of coming to power in Russia. It would not be the first time in history of Russian counterintelligence operations that the Western intelligence agencies send the money to the fake KGB-controlled opposition, and thus ironically helped fund the efforts directed against themselves. Such, for instance, were the Operation Trust in the 1920s in the Baltics and Western Europe, and the Operation Win in the late 1940s and early 1950s in Poland. In this view, Navalny is to be considered a leader of the vocal but controlled opposition, acting out for the Western eyes only, but in reality preserving the Putin regime. And already one can see a lot of suspicion of Navalny among other opposition leaders, and not only the communists. According to the communists, Navalny is like a younger Yeltsin, only sober. He wants to bring back to power the corrupt pro-Western oligarchs that ruled the country during the 1990s. The changes Navalny talks about are superficial and will not lead to what the communists think Russia must do to recover, which is a radical reorientation of economic and social policies toward a socialistic political and economic system. The communists want the nationalization of the economy and the increase of all social programs and benefits for the ordinary people. They want the capital to work for the people and not the people for the capital. They demand that the people take power and not the Siloviks or the liberals. For them, there is no essential difference between Yeltsin and Putin's economic policies. The only difference is in the foreign policy. But the communists state that Putin has not been willing to do things he must do if Russia is to rise again to the superpower status. The communists suspect that, notwithstanding his rhetoric, Putin is still beholden to some circles in the West. After all, Putin stresses his friendship with Henry Kissinger. In this article, the communists call for countrywide economic and social protests, not only against corruption, but also against the capitalist system in general. They claim that in the next few months, they will offer a long-term detailed plan on how to rejuvenate Russia. This plan will chart a new course for Russia, and according to the article, should lead to the merging of all patriotic and social democratic political forces in Russia against both the Putin regime and the Western-supported liberals. One can perhaps call this political option the third Russia. And no doubt, this option will emphasize the necessity of the strong paternalistic state apparatus, both for domestic and international matters. It is still too early to estimate the success of this political option, especially as it is still not known who will be the presidential candidate of the communists. Whether this will be the perennial leader, Gennady Zyuganov, who lost all presidential elections in the last 20 years, or somebody new and more energetic. But whoever the communists choose, one thing is already absolutely certain. He or she will have more supporters than any candidate that the West, the CIA, and the MI6 included, can come up with. Dear friends, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Please support Newsbud and independent, people-oriented media. And of course, be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian newspapers Monitor.
For just a small subscription fee, you can become a member of the Newsbud community and help keep this website running. Your subscription will provide you with full community access to exclusive content, including videos and articles from Newsbud's team of experts and analysts, as well as a members-only monthly newsletter from Newsbud's founder, Sibel Edmonds. Sign up today for full access at newsbud.com.